So we've all heard that ChatGPT can write a high school term paper and a teacher won't be able to tell the difference. It'll do a reasonably good job. However, I don't believe we can trust ChatGPT or artificial intelligence for research. And just to prove that, let me grab this Elizabeth Rundle Charles quote. Vodi Bakum has this quote in the beginning of his book, Fault Lines. How good is AI at research? Can AI identify the source of this quote? It is the truth which is assailed in any age which tests our fidelity. It is to confess we are called, not merely to profess. If I profess with the loudest voice and the clearest exposition every portion of the truth of God, except precisely that little point which the world and the devil are at that moment attacking, I am not confessing Christ, however boldly I may be professing Christianity. Where the battle rages, the loyalty of the soldier is proved, and to be steady on all the battlefield besides is mere flight and disgrace to him if he flinches at that one point. Elizabeth Charles Rundle was an English author that lived in the 19th century. This quote is often confused with a Martin Luther quote of similar sentiment, but let's see how AI does with researching it. During this video, I'll be researching with AI to identify the source of the Elizabeth Rundle quote. You'll see AI's responses, and I'll be just summarizing them, but feel free to pause the video to read the screen capture if you want to read AI's responses in full. Vodi Bakum has this quote in the beginning of his book, Fault Lines. It's a good quote by Elizabeth Rundle Charles. I'm going to ask ChatGPT who said it. And it says it's from John Henry Newman. Notice here that ChatGPT says the quote is from John Henry Newman. So then I'll say, where can I find it? Also notice that ChatGPT, the John Henry Newman and Elizabeth Rundle Charles are basically, their lives overlapped significantly. They both died in the 1890s. Oh, that's interesting. He says it's from the New Evangelization Overcoming Obstacles from chapter 16. But now I'm going to say, what about Elizabeth Rundle? It says, I apologize for any confusion. The quote you provided in your initial question is commonly attributed to John, not Elizabeth Rundle Charles. Okay, so then I'll say, are you sure? Whoops. Okay, it says, apologize after reevaluating the quote. An additional, I couldn't find any direct okay, and it's sticking with John Henry Newman. That's intriguing. I'm going to give it the specific book that Elizabeth Rundle Charles Okay, so to recap, I asked her, what about Elizabeth Rundle Charles? And it says it's attributed to Newman, not Elizabeth Rundle Charles. Then I say, are you sure? I couldn't find any direct attribution to Elizabeth Rundle Charles. Then I gave it the book. It's from the Schoenberg Cotta family, a novel. And then it says, the quote you provided earlier is indeed from Elizabeth Rundle Charles, the work, The Chronicles of the Schoenberg Family. The book is a historical novel set during the time of the Protestant Reformation in Germany. So now I'm going to ask it, what about John Henry Newman? And now it's toggled back. It says it's, you know, the quote is attributed to John Henry Newman, not Elizabeth Rundle Charles. Then I'll ask it, are you sure? And it's sticking with John Henry Newman. I'll ask it where Newman wrote the quote. And it says it doesn't have a specific text, but earlier it did. Then I'm going to repeat the question about Elizabeth Rundle Charles. And now it's back to saying the quote is from Elizabeth Rundle Charles. Now, this Elizabeth Rundle Charles quote is often attributed to Martin Luther because Luther had a similar quote, and obviously Luther predates Elizabeth Rundle Charles. The quote is, neither is it of any help if someone would say, I will gladly confess Christ and his word in every other article, except that I may keep silence about one or two that my tyrants may not tolerate, such as both species in the sacrament and the like. For whoever denies Christ in one article or word has denied the same Christ in that one article, who would be denied by denying all the articles, since there is only one Christ in all his words, taken all together or singly. So I'm going to ask it who said that. And it says it's from Martin Luther. I'm going to ask it if it's sure. The Luther quote is, okay, now it's toggled to John Calvin. I apologize for any confusion. The quote you provided is not from Martin Luther. I made an error in my previous response. The quote you've mentioned is actually from John Calvin. So at least it's got a contemporary right. I mean, it's possible Calvin quoted Luther. It's possible, since Elizabeth Rundle Charles and Newman were contemporaries, that Newman was quoting Elizabeth Rundle Charles, but ChatGPT seems to be all over the map on this. So I'm going to ask it, are you sure? Oh, now it's saying it's not from Martin Luther or John Calvin. The quote you mentioned is attributed to Andreas Osiander, 16th century Lutheran theologian. I wonder if that's accurate. I'm going to go to Google. I mean, I wonder if there's any reason to attribute this quote. It's not easy to tell right here, but now we've got three contenders for this quote, and again, it's possible he's a 16th century, so they're all contemporaries. So I guess it's within the realm of possibility that I'm going to re-ask my initial question and see if it comes up with Elizabeth Rundle Charles or John Henry Newman. Okay, now it's going back to John Henry Newman. Ask it if it's sure. And it's sticking with Newman. I'm going to ask him where Newman said the quote. And it doesn't have anything as a paraphrased representation. Although earlier, if you'll recall, it did give me a quote. Now I'm going to re-ask the question that caused it to toggle. And now we're back to Elizabeth Rendell Charles. Now that I asked it, I gave it the title of the book that Elizabeth Rendell Charles quoted it in. I'll ask it, are you sure? See if we can toggle back to Newman. And it says that it's attributed to her, but it doesn't have specific information. It may be paraphrased. So it's starting to waffle. I'll ask it about John Henry Newman. And now we're back to John Henry Newman. If you do a Google search on the quote, you only come up with Elizabeth Rendell Charles, and you come up with the fact that it's often attributed to Luther, most likely because, it's often attributed to Luther, most likely because of that earlier quote that is so similar. But ChatGPT takes the Luther quote and says it could be John Calvin, could be Martin Luther, or it could be that other fellow whose name I've already forgotten, Andreas Osiander. So there you have it. Tom Grieve has a YouTube video where he says some lawyers used ChatGPT to write a legal brief, and it actually fouled up. It wrote a good, convincing legal brief, but if you looked up the footnotes, all the law citations were fabricated and inaccurate. And it looks like the same thing would happen to you if you were depending upon it to source quotes. You just can't be certain what it's doing.